Thanks, Nora, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak. My paper examines the structure of Sūrat al-Anʿām with special reference to the content of verses 136 through 153, which contain an involved discussion of pagan sacrifice and dietary restrictions for the Quranic community, and which conclude with a Quranic paraphrase of the Decalogue. My goal is to understand the relationship between those verses, which I view as a discrete section of the surah, and the themes and structure of the surah as a whole. I accept Nikolai Sinai's proposal in an article on what he called the Quran's dietary tetralogue that some of those verses are likely a Medinan addition to what is generally considered a Meccan surah. But my point here is about the subtle change in the surah's theological focus that the addition of those and possibly other verses brings to the surah when considered as a finished product. In a nutshell, I will argue that the addition of the lengthy legal passage at the surah's end converts what begins as a consistent focus on abstract theological propositions to a focus on rules and behaviors, or put more simply, from a concern with thought to a concern with action. My argument provides some additional support for Sinai's conclusions, but support of a very different kind than he adduced, I think, and perhaps support for considering some additional verses to be late-stage additions. So with all due caution, I will explore the hypothesis that the augmentation of the surah's theological concerns occasioned by that additional material may reflect a diachronic process of composition. And this is not the kind of argument I'm accustomed to making, but it is where my thinking about this surah ended up, so maybe you will help me think it through. I had planned to say something about law, but this has actually receded in importance in regard to what I think is important about this surah now, so I'm going to not go into that, but we can talk about that later if you want. Instead, I'm going to jump right into what I think the surah is about and how it's structured. So I would say that Sūrat al-Anʿām has three distinct kinds of material: polemic, biblical references, and rules for the Quranic audience. Although polemical sections dominate the surah, all three kinds of material are distributed across the whole surah and are sometimes complexly intertwined. The polemical sections aim at various attitudes and beliefs of the text's pagan opponents, for example, their denial of signs, scripture, monotheism, and an impending judgment. The biblical references consist of a narrative involving Abraham, the occasional invocation of figures from biblical history, some references to Moses in connection with scripture, and a paraphrase of the Decalogue. The rules relate to ritual and in some ways to ethics, and although they seem to me to be conceptually distinct from the polemic that dominates the surah, they are generally framed as part of a monotheistic project and in some instances have a loose biblical framing. So I divide the surah into thematic sections that exhibit these three types of material. The surah contains 4 separate polemical sections that argue for the recognition of signs, though with subtle differences in emphasis, 2 sections on ritual and rules, and 1 section containing biblical narrative. So let me briefly describe what makes these sections thematically distinct. I'll begin with the polemical sections, since they are actually the majority of the material, and then turn to the biblical narrative, and conclude with an examination of the passages on ritual and rules, and of the surah's concluding section. The 4 polemical sections are easily recognizable because of the prominence of the term āyāt, signs, in them, and the frequent accusations in them that the text's opponents fail to consider the āyāt that are made available to them. By contrast, the term āyāt is completely absent from the biblical narrative and barely occurs in the 2 sections on ritual and rules. Of course, the whole surah is polemical in some sense, but I'm using that term here to refer to the text's focused arguments in these sections that the opponents should assent to certain theological propositions. Each of the polemical sections has a distinctive emphasis, but they are all united in their frequent reference to āyāt and the opponent's failure to heed those āyāt. The first and longest polemical section runs from verses 4 to 73, and its concern is the denial of divinely provided signs. Not only is the word sign prominent, but so is the word, or rather the verb kadhaba, to deny. The specific matters that are denied make for a long list in this section of the surah. They include signs, of course, but also revelation or scripture, the truth in general, al-Haqq, resurrection, punishment of previous communities, the prospect of having to face God, and the afterlife in general. The theme of denial appears immediately in the surah's opening section too, with accusations that the opponents disbelieve in their Lord, kafaru bi rabbihim, that's in verse 1, and they are accused of doubting that God created them and then made their lives to be for a fixed term in verse 2. The surah's opening section and the following verses through verse 73 are remarkably consistent in their topics and vocabulary. Now, it's possible that the entire first section of the surah, verses 1 through 73, was originally an independent text. Maybe we could imagine it as a homily warning against the denial of God's signs. The final hymn-like verse of this whole run of text, through verse 73, reiterates that God is creator, that his word is true, that he exercises dominion, that he will resurrect people, and that he is omniscient. It could be understood as affirming the matters that are said to be doubted by the text's opponents, which themselves are pithily summarized in verse 1. And you can see, I think, there's a high degree of lexical and conceptual correspondence between verse 1 and verse 73. And they make a nice start and end point, I think, to this whole section of the surah. Now I'm going to go back to my outline just so we can follow my discussion. The other polemical sections continue the theme of sign denial, but also exhibit more focused emphases. The second polemic section, which runs from verses 91 to 117, focuses on monotheism in Scripture. It emphasizes God's creative power, omnipotence, and omniscience, all attributes that the text opponents fail to appreciate, as it says, وَمَا قَدَرُوا اللَّهَ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, right? They do not appreciate God fully in the way he ought to be appreciated. Moses is mentioned, and his kitab is distinguished from the instant kitab in verses 91 and 92. The opponents are accused of denying the authenticity or authority of the instant scripture in verses 105, 106, 115. And this is characterized, the whole text, as a warning to the people in the vicinity of Mecca. The third polemical section at verses 122 through 135, which concentrates on salvation and damnation, exhibits a high degree of internal lexical consistency. It twice uses the word qarya, twice uses the word dar to refer to the next life. It contains two addresses that use the phrase ya ma'shar al-jinn in connection with the word an-nas, and it refers twice to the fact that emissaries brought signs. It concludes with an extended threat of punishment for the people and jinn who failed to heed the signs brought by those emissaries. The fourth and final polemical section, verses 154 to 160, concentrates on scripture and again distinguishes between the scripture received by Moses and the instant scripture. This is Mohsen's two kitab theory in action here, nicely demonstrated. Those who fail to recognize the authority of the instant scripture deny the signs sent by God. It says, فَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنْ كَذَّبَ بِآيَاتِ اللَّهِ in verse 157. So who is a greater wrongdoer than the person who denies God's signs? The sign denial motif is relentless in all four polemical sections. So let me now turn to the biblical narrative at verses 74 through 90. It illustrates the theological propositions that are argued for in the long opening polemical section and also in the other polemical sections, or so I would argue. It recounts how Abraham, through a series of inferences based on observation of heavenly bodies, reaches a particular understanding of monotheism. By observing that stars, the moon, and the sun all set, Abraham deduces that they cannot, probably because of their impermanence, be the sole deity. And he declares himself quit of his community's paganism. He says, Inni bari'un mimma tushrikun. So I'm quit of the things that you associate with God. And he is confirmed as a Hanif. His reasoning is deductive, since he begins with an implicit premise that God cannot exhibit change or movement. He uses the signs in the heavens, stars, moon, sun, to confirm his deduction. God is expressly described as creator of the heavens in many places in the surah, but also in verses 1 and 73, as we saw. These verses bookend the entire opening section, and so the narrative fits tightly with the preceding material and the material in all of the polemical sections. Even though the premise of divine immutability seems not to be mentioned as one of the specific propositions to which the text's opponents should assent, the truth of that premise is demonstrated through the narrative in which Abraham correctly heeds the natural signs made available to him, and this point is made expressly in verse 75, which says, وَكَذَلِكَ نُورِي إِبْرَاهِيمَ مَلْكُوتَ السَّمَوَاتِ. Thus do we show Abraham the kingdom of the heavens. The enduring correctness of his deduction is then further emphasized in the long list of biblical successors whose names appear in the succeeding verses, and it is said that they have been favored with divine guidance, as well as scripture, authority, and prophecy. أَتَيْنَاهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحُكْمَ وَالنُّبُوَّةَ. Now, the key point here is that the polemical sections and the Abraham narrative are different ways of making exactly the same point, which is that correct interpretation of the divinely furnished signs leads to acceptance of the theological propositions listed in all the polemical sections. I think that's clear. But what's important about those theological propositions is that they are abstract and non-empirical. Okay? They are the normal propositions associated with monotheism in that sense. So let me talk about the sections on ritual and rules now, because this is where the surah changes. The two sections on ritual and rules, from verses 118 through 121 and 136 through 153, I would argue fit less well with the themes and language of the sections on polemic and biblical narrative. The emphasis in those two sections on specific actions contrasts with the arguments that urge assent to theological propositions and that occur in the surah's four polemical sections and in the Abraham narrative. The first ritual section, from verse 118 to 121, urges the Quranic audience to eat only what has the name of God mentioned over it. This injunction is presented in several different forms or formulations from verses 118 to 121. The Quran's injunctions to eat from what has had God's name mentioned over it appear mostly in contexts that discuss ritual sacrifice and ritual slaughter. This language is used several times in Sūrat al-Baqarah in connection with the pilgrimage rites, also in Sūrat al-Hajj, and once in Sūrat al-Ma'idah in the context of hunting. Right? Hunting is problematic for ritual slaughter because it's a form of remote killing. Right? Now, it's difficult to know whether the reference here at verses 118 to 121 to the mention of God's name refers to slaughter in the ordinary course or only to animal sacrifice. Either is possible. But the injunction at 118 to 121 in those verses marks a significant change in the content of the surah because it moves from creedal matters to ritual action. Now, does this change in subject matter allow us to infer that this ritual material is in some sense intrusive, a late-stage addition or insertion of some kind, for example? I'm going back and forth on this question, but I think one can rationalize the appearance here of this material as an organic continuation of the preceding content on the grounds that it only urges the audience to do something very simple and underdetermined, which is to pronounce God's name, for example, in thanks for divinely provided bounty, since God is the creator of everything, a point made throughout the surah. The four verses in question are very unspecific in regard to ritual requirements, and they leave unclear whether sacrifice or ordinary slaughter is the issue. So Nikolai Sinai thinks these four verses, and I'm quoting, were only secondarily embedded in Surah 6. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I do think he's right when he says that the phrase in verse 119, وَقَدْ فَصَّلَ لَكُمْ مَا حَرَّمَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِلَّا مَا اضْطُرِرْتُمْ إِلَيْهِ may be a later addition. And that is because that phrase corresponds almost exactly with the language of every other dietary prohibition in the Qur'an. Okay, it includes both a reference to what God has outlawed and also the technical exception phrase, إِلَّا مَا اضْطُرِرْتُمْ إِلَيْهِ. So I think some general reference to the mention of God's name in connection with the consumption of food in some form is probably compatible with the original version of this surah, whatever that might have looked like. But I would agree with Nikolai that that phrase probably is later. Now, the second passage on ritual and rules, which occurs nearer the surah's end, from verses 136 to 153, is much more extensive and complex. It consists of two parts. One, a detailed description of food and sacrifice-related rituals, and one, a paraphrase of the Decalogue. So I'm going to discuss those separately, and it's too much text really to put on a slide, so if you have a mushaf or a phone with the Quran, you may want to follow along. So the ritual section of that part of the surah is surprisingly detailed. It goes from verse 136 to 150, surprisingly detailed in its description of practices of the Quranic pagans. It contains more ethical vocabulary than the first ritual passage, and also uses more vocabulary that links to earlier verses in the surah. Its contents can be summarized as follows. The first four verses present pagan ritual sacrifice practices. The final verse of those four alleges that the pagans also practice something like child sacrifice. And these verses also contain criticism of these practices, which in general accuse the pagans of misallocating sacrificial meat in a way that deprives God of an appropriate share. Verses 141 to 142 then could be understood, which follow, as a hymn to God the Creator, and this is a passage that Julien discussed yesterday. And God, as the creator, causes produce to grow and makes animals available for labor and consumption. And the Quranic audience is then encouraged in open-ended terms to consume God's bounty. Kullu mimma razaqakum, in verse 142. An injunction that contrasts with the complex pagan rites just described. More pagan rites follow in the next two verses, but the text poses questions about them that are designed to caricature them or to emphasize their complexity and irrationality. That's in verses 143 and 144. At this point, the text offers, in verse 145, a brief list of dietary rules to govern the Quranic community. And those rules prohibit consumption of carrion, blood, pork, and anything consecrated to other than God. This list is framed as legislatively minimalist, as I have argued previously. قُلْ لَا أَجِدُ مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ مُحَرَّمًا عَلَى طَاعِمٍ يَطْعَمُهُ إِلَّا أَنْ يَكُونَ مَيْتَةً. So I think rhetorically the idea with that wording is that these four things are the only things that are prohibited. And this minimalist framing contrasts, again, with the elaborate and pointless pagan sacrifice rituals depicted in the preceding verses, and it reinforces the idea that the bounty of God the Creator is available, easily available to humans. The Quran's dietary rules in this verse, in verse 145, are then contrasted with certain enhanced dietary restrictions said to have been imposed on the Jews as a punishment in the following verse, verse 146. The verses that follow then contain a polemical exchange with various hostile interlocutors, and the treatment of ritual closes with the point that the pagan practices are not grounded in any authority, and that there is no divine sanction and no witness for them, and that their practitioners, in fact, deny the signs that God has provided. They are described as الَّذِينَ كَذَّبُوا بِآيَاتِنَا. After this substantial treatment of pagan sacrifice, Jewish dietary rules, and the minimal rules that apply to the Quranic community, the text then presents a paraphrase of the Decalogue at verses 151 to 152. I have also argued in an earlier publication that this passage is also framed as minimalist, in keeping with the way in which the dietary rules were presented in verse 145. It enjoins the following practices on the Quranic audience: monotheism, honoring parents, no unlawful sexual relations, no infanticide, no homicide except by legal right, all in verse 151. And then in 152, no usurpation of orphans' property, honest use of weights and measures, I think probably a reference to not bearing false witness, and fulfillment of the covenant. And the whole list is characterized as God's straight path, in هَذَا صِرَاطِي مُسْتَقِيمًا at verse 153. So this is one of 5 paraphrases of the Decalogue that appear in the Qur'an. I've argued in an earlier article also that these passages all signify differently depending on the surah context in which they appear. And in this case, I would argue that this version is presented as an example of minimalist legislation, and that it, like the dietary rules at verse 145, implicitly contrast with the complex pagan rites and punitive Jewish dietary rules that are presented earlier. Somewhat like the case of verses 118 through 121, but much, much more so here, this entire extensive discussion of rituals and rules, I would argue, fits uneasily in a surah that in all its other sections urges the contemplation of signs with the goal of mental assent to theological propositions. Nikolai has argued that the dietary rules at verse 145 and possibly the 2 following verses were inserted at a later stage of the formation of the surah to provide a counterexample to accusations of pagan fabrication of ritual requirements that are made in some of the preceding verses in this section. While I agree that the references to dietary rules and to Judaism at verses 145 and 146 are perhaps surprising in the midst of an anti-pagan polemic, I would propose that this whole run of text from verse 136 to 153 may in fact be a later addition to a surah that is otherwise mostly about theological questions. Whether verses 145 through 147 are an even later insertion into that group of verses, as Nikolai proposes, I don't know, but that certainly seems possible for the reasons that he gives. So I think one possible scenario is that this whole section from verse 136 to 153 was attracted to the surah's end by the references to the mentioning of God's name in verses 118 through 121, which is a fairly minimal, it's not even a rule really, right? It's a suggestion to give thanks in a way. And in that case, if that's right, if this later run of text from verse 136 to 153 was attracted to the surah by the passage at 118 to 121, we would have an example of what Nikolai called in another publication of his, resumptive repetition, an appendicular expansion of a potential legal idea found earlier in the surah through the secondary edition of the discussion of pagan sacrifice, Jewish and Quranic dietary rules, and a paraphrase of the Decalogue. Okay. So thus far, I have argued that Sūrat al-Anʿām may originally have consisted exclusively of an argument for the necessity of heeding the signs provided by God, and that a correct understanding of those signs would lead to a correct understanding of certain principles of Quranic theology. I have then claimed that the treatment of rituals and rules at verses 136 to 153 differs markedly from the rest of the material of the surah in its emphasis on action, and it represents therefore a later addition to some earlier version of the surah that emphasized sign polemic and theology. So let me now turn to the surah's closing section, which I think reflects a late-stage theological adjustment to the surah's conclusion that was necessitated by the addition of the legal and ritual materials near the surah's end. I identify the closing section as consisting of 5 verses, 161 through 165. It clearly has 2 parts. The first part, which stretches over the first 3 verses, contains 2 passages that begin with qul. Okay? قُلْ إِنِّي هَدَانِي رَبِّي إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ دِينًا قِيَمًا مِلَّةَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ حَنِيفًا وَمَا كَانَ مِنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ قل إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين لا شريك له وبذلك أمرت وأنا أول المسلمين. These 3 verses are markedly shorter than the surah's last 2 verses, and I would suggest that they may be the original ending to a surah focused on sign polemics and theological propositions. They emphasize divine guidance, biblical forebears, monotheism, and divine dominion. The final phrase of verse 163, وَأَنَا أَوَّلُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ, echoes a much earlier verse from the first polemical section, verse 14, which says, قُلْ إِنِّي أُمِرْتُ أَنْ أَكُونَ أَوَّلَ مَنْ أَسْلَمَ. It is the same idea, right? That would be a fitting way to wrap up a surah on sign polemic. Now, you will have noticed that verse 162 contains the phrase salati wa nusuki. If I am right that these verses are the original ending to the surah, then that phrase would be a back reference to verse 118 through 121, where the Quranic audience was enjoined to eat only of that which has God's name mentioned over it. Salat and nusuk could easily refer to the requirement to mention God's name. Salat need not refer to the full ritual prayer here. But the last 2 verses of the surah, 164 and 165, differ considerably from the 3 preceding verses. They expressly treat the relationship between action and salvation, and they're also considerably longer and more complex than the 2 preceding verses. Verse 164 expressly refers to action, individual responsibility, and salvational consequences, kasb, wazira, marja. And verse 165 refers to earthly social differentiation and one's response to it, the ideas of khalifa, right, darajat, yabluwakum. So once the extensive ritual and legal materials had been incorporated near the surah's end, the surah's original theological orientation around signs and theological propositions became augmented by the detailed references to right and wrong acts. This augmentation required a supplement to the surah's ending, and we can see the 2 orientations clearly reflected in the 2-part conclusion to the surah. Verses 161 through 163 conclude the discussion of signs and theology, and verses 164 through 165 conclude the discussion of action. So let me conclude. This is all to say that the addition of a substantial legal appendix to Sūrat al-Anʿām transformed the surah from one kind of theological argument to another kind, or maybe from one more or less unified theological argument to an argument that became more complex with the addition of action as a criterion of salvation. It may be, if Nikolai is right, and I think he is, that some of the materials at the surah's end are Medinan. I would probably be prepared to argue that more of them are than he would. The resulting text, Surah 6, in the received version that we have now, reflects the theological shift that accompanied the rise of legislation in the Medinan Qur'an. This shift is also something we can see in the different uses of law in Meccan and Medinan surahs. In Meccan surahs, law is incidental to narrative. We see it in Surat Yusuf in regard to enslavement, unlawful sexual relations, imprisonment, and theft. We see it in the Salih narrative in Sūrat al-Naml, where the plotters plan to deceive Salih's next of kin so that no lawful vengeance may be taken, or even in the episodes in Sūrat al-Kahf, where the figure Khidr protects property from usurpation, but also destroys property and even commits murder. That's an illustration of natural law, right? The point in these Meccan stories is always ethical, and the content of the rules is secondary. But Medinan legislation is not like that. It is frequently detailed and systematic, and it presents itself as primary, not as secondary to some other set of considerations. The rules in Sūrat al-Anʿām in this respect look much more Medinan than Meccan. And while the surah's second section on rules and ritual, from verses 136 to 153, clearly constitutes a discrete formal unit, its contribution to the surah as a whole is not really aesthetic, which is what I thought I was going to find when I began thinking about this surah. Instead, it is the introduction of a new theological idea that necessitated adjustments to the surah's ending. Thank you.